and litigate through the courts to see how the current laws that we have are going to apply to video games. And so there's anyone who colloquially knows lawsuits are notoriously slow. That's true. So there's going to be 2 years to go to trial, another 2 years for appeal, another 2 years for the second appeal if it goes that far. So you're looking at like 6 years just for the courts to figure out if the current laws can handle the new technology. Then if you want to legislate something, legislation can take an incredibly long time. One of the primary protections for video games that developers rely on to know is copyright law. All right, the most recent Copyright Act was passed in 1976, and it was the Copyright Act of 1976.
Clever name.
Clever name. But what a lot of people don't realize is that they started working on that act in 1963. All right, so in 1963, they decided they needed to revamp the copyright laws. And they said, well, we should have it done in a year, so we're just going to extend everyone's copyright for 1 year until we can pass the full act next year, right? So 1964 rolls around, they're still bickering about what the Copyright Act should say, so they say, well, wait, no, we'll do it next year. We'll hammer everything out next year. They did this every year until 1976. So, it takes a long time for legislation to get passed. And then, it takes a long time for courts to adapt to new legislation. And it happens every time there's new technology.
I think you also need to take into account political expediency. When the woman I now refer to as she whose name shall not be spoken jumped on the bandwagon after hot coffee, and I was a supporter of hers until that happened. But it was clearly pandering in something, she whose name shall not be spoken is a lawyer. She knows what the First Amendment is. She should have known better than to support a bill that was on its face unconstitutional, but she got a hell of a lot of press out of it. And the funny thing is, it wasn't the content of the game that pushed her over the edge. It was the fact that all of a sudden there was all this press on it. So a lot of these, a lot of conservative legislators, there's also this whole this guy named John Beck did a book called the Game On, the Gamer Generation, and it was actually a sociological study that was done about 5 years ago, and it showed that people at the time 42 years and older, about 20% of them played games, and people 40 years and under, about 80% of them played games. So there's clearly a disconnect there. There's a generational disconnect because of the advent of technology. And you're absolutely right, the older people, they're still afraid of their computers, and you talk to them about video games, and they don't understand. They don't have a comprehension of it. It's not valid entertainment to them, and they don't understand the dynamic of it. So, it's just really an easy target. When I was speaking against the passage of the bill in Florida, I mentioned that, and I will admit that I'm old enough to remember this, the outrage against Elvis Presley when he was on television and how they wouldn't show his hips because he was gyrating his hips, and he was considered to be an evil influence on America. And I had one of these legislators just accuse me of friggin' blasphemy. You would have think I was saying this about Jesus Christ or something. The guy was just whacked out about me possibly ever saying that anyone would criticize Elvis Presley. So don't worry, it'll turn around. but we may have to wait 20 years for it to happen.
And quick follow-up, is there anything you'd recommend other than people like us voting to accelerate that process?
Oh, please vote, would you? Yeah. And then vote again if you can. And also lobby.
Early and often.
No, I'm serious about this. You should also be lobbying people. Don't lobby people like you. Lobby people like me, okay? Or not like me, but my age, Talk to your parents about this. Talk to your grandparents about it. Explain to them how really valuable this experience is. There's a lot of work that's been done by guys like James G. and others about the real powerful learning dynamic, multi-level learning dynamic that occurs when people play video games, especially children. This is without question the most innovative and powerful teaching medium since the printed word. And we need to get that message out. We need to talk about how really good this is for people.
All right, next question.
Just led into my question really well there, and I think you kind of answered it partially, but why is the video game lobby essentially less effective than other lobbies from similar industries where there's just as much violence, just as much negative impacting, money, okay.
Yes.
But I think is there
I mean,
anything
part of
about
it,
money?
yeah, and it's also, it's up to date. I think it's been primarily responsive as opposed to proactive. You know, there are works out there on the value of interactive multimedia teaching techniques, which is what games are. And I don't see a lot of people pimping that. I don't see, plus it's like, you know, there's a lot more sex appeal when somebody says something's bad than when somebody says something's good. And, you know, we live in a media-driven society, and I think it's easier for the media to pick low-hanging fruit, rather than go into something that might be actually, you know, intellectually stimulating or valid.
Next question.
Sorry, I'm short.
When's the flight leave? I love your outfit.
Thank you. I've been told I look like a flight attendant a lot, actually. I came to the panel a little bit late, so I apologize if you've addressed my question already, but I was really interested when I read about the property rights in games, and especially not only property that you acquire within the games, but maybe identity theft. There's a lot of account hacking going on, and also crimes that result from theft of objects in games. I don't know, you know, there are a lot of rumors that fly around, but I had heard a story of a fellow who, you know, took his friend's account and took all of his stuff, and the guy went over to his house and killed him. So
True story.
So yeah, so I was wondering if you could speak to any of those issues. I'd like to.
We're actually planning on addressing that in the second half of there. But while
We're doing legislation and violence against games right now, but we'll get to that, I promise.
Okay.
But while I do have you up there, there was a recent court decision in China, actually.
A court in China?
Yeah, the actual working court in China that not only basically what happened in the case was a player stole a bunch of I don't even remember what the game was, but it would be the equivalent of like the highest level epic weapon. For whatever reason, they didn't have it bound to that particular character, and he stole it from another person. And the court not only made him give it back, but also fined him as well a significant amount of money. I think it was equivalent to about $11,000 in U.S.
But they didn't kill him.
No, unfortunately, they didn't kill him.
I mean, the case you're thinking of, it also was in China, where two guys jointly purchased this sword in whatever game they were playing, and they jointly purchased it and agreed to swap it back and forth so they could both use it. And you know, when one of the guy's characters had it, he refused to turn it over to the other guy and basically, you know, ignored him. So the other guy got upset and came over and stabbed him. With a different sword.
And incidentally, the company that distributes World of Warcraft in China is actually right now facing a major lawsuit about this as well. But we'll get to more on that later on. Thank you. And by the way, we'll cut off the questions on this section after you and the red shirt.
So Tom, you mentioned that the Violence in Video Game Act has been largely unchanged, and it's fundamentally like a spit in the face of the First Amendment. Is it possible that that's just a political tool to make the conservatives perpetual victims? Is there any reason that they wouldn't be changing this as an actual political ploy?
I think it was the fact that, you know, legislators don't like to actually write legislation. The vast amount of legislation is either drafted for them by their staff or more likely given to them by someone in an industry, or in this case, a public interest group that has a special interest. And I think Jack was basically shopping this around. That Wacky Jackie was shopping this around through his fundamentalist network, and finding legislators who'd be willing to sponsor it in each state. And they'd look it over and say, yeah, sure, I'll put my name on this, and then they'd stick it in the bin with all the other bills, and then they'd get good press off of it, so they're thinking, oh, this is really cool, you know, this worked for me. And that's all they were really looking for.
Okay.
I sort of, you know, we discussed possibly going into the New York Act. I know New York has recently done a new version of the act, and I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But it may be different. I don't know. I think if they take the criminalization out of it, they can get past a lot of the issues. But I still think there's a question